Section 3. A case in point. It is as natural to our commercial critics to argue in a circle as to travel on the inner circle. It is not mere stupidity, but it is mere habit, and it is not easy either to break into or to escape from that iron ring. When we say things can be done, we commonly mean either that they could be done by the mass of men, or else by the ruler of the state. I gave an example of something that could be done quite easily by the mass, and here I will give an example of something that could be done quite easily by the ruler. But we must be prepared for our critics beginning to argue in a circle, and saying that the present populace will never agree, or the present ruler act in that way. But this complaint is a confusion. We are answering people who call our ideal impossible in itself. If you do not want it, of course, you will not try to get it. But do not say that because you do not want it, it follows that you could not get it if you did want it. A thing does not become intrinsically impossible merely by a mob not trying to obtain it. Nor does a thing cease to be practical politics because no politician is practical enough to do it. I will start with a small and familiar example. In order to ensure that our huge proletariat should have a holiday, we have a law obliging all employers to shut their shops for half a day once a week. Given the proletarian principle, it is a healthy and necessary thing for a proletarian state, just as the saturnalia is a healthy and necessary thing for a slave state. Given this provision for the proletariat, a practical person will naturally say, it has other advantages too. It will be a chance for anybody who chooses to do his own dirty work, for the man who can manage without servants. That degraded being who actually knows how to do things himself will have a look in at last. That isolated crank who can really work for his own living may possibly have a chance to live. A man does not need to be a distributist to say this. It is the ordinary and obvious thing that anybody would say. The man who has servants must cease to work his servants. Of course, the man who has no servants to work cannot cease to work them. But the law is actually so constructed that it forces this man also to give a holiday to the servants he has not got. He proclaims a saturnalia that never happens to a crowd of phantom slaves that have never been there. Now, there is not a rudiment of reason about this arrangement. In every possible sense, from the immediate material to the abstract and mathematical sense, it is quite mad. We live in days of dangerous division of interest between the employer and the employed. Therefore, even when the two are not divided, but actually united in one person, we must divide them again into two parties. We coerce a man into giving himself something he does not want, because somebody else who does not exist might want it. We warn him that he had better receive a deputation from himself, or he might go on strike against himself. Perhaps he might even become a Bolshevist, and throw a bomb at himself. In which case he would have no other course left to his stern sense of law and order but to read the riot act and shoot himself. They call us unpractical, but we have not yet produced such an academic fantasy as this. They sometimes suggest that our regret for the disappearance of the yeoman or the apprentice is a mere matter of sentiment. Sentimental? We have not quite sunk to such sentimentalism as to be sorry for apprentices who never existed at all. We have not quite reached that richness of romantic emotion that we are capable of weeping more copiously for an imaginary grocer's assistant than for a real grocer. We are not quite so maudlin yet as to see double when we look into our favourite little shop, or to set the little shopkeeper fighting with his own shadow. Let us leave these hard-headed and practical men of business shedding tears over the sorrow of a non-existent office boy, and proceed upon our own wild and erratic path, that at least happens to pass across the land of the living. Now, if so small a change as that were made tomorrow, it would make a difference, a considerable and increasing difference. And if any rash apologist of big business tells me that a little thing like that could make very little difference, let him beware, for he is doing the one thing which such apologists commonly avoid above all things. He is contradicting his masters. Among the 1,000 things of interest, which are lost in the million things of no interest, in the newspaper reports of Parliament and public affairs, there really was one delightful little comedy dealing with this point. Some man of normal sense and popular instincts, who had strayed into Parliament by some mistake or other, actually pointed out this plain fact, that there was no need to protect the proletariat when there was no proletariat to protect. and that the lonely shopkeeper might, therefore, remain in his lonely shop. And the minister in charge of the matter actually replied, with a ghastly innocence, that it was impossible, for it would be unfair to the big shops. Tears evidently flow freely in such circles, as they did from the rising politician Lord Lundy, and in this case it was the mere thought of the possible sufferings of the millionaires that moved him. There rose before his imagination Mr. Selfridge in his agony, and the groans of Mr. Woolworth of the Woolworth Tower thrilled through the kind hearts to which the cry of the sorrowing rich will never come in vain. But whatever we may think of the sensibility needed to regard the big store owners as objects of sympathy, at any rate it disposes at a stroke of all the fashionable fatalism that sees something inevitable in their success. It is absurd to tell us that our attack is bound to fail, and then that there would be something quite unscrupulous in its so immediately succeeding. Apparently, big business must be accepted because it is invulnerable, and spared because it is vulnerable. This big absurd bubble can never conceivably be burst, and it is simply cruel that a little pinprick of competition can burst it. I do not know whether the big shops are quite so weak and wobbly as their champion said, but whatever the immediate effect on the big shops, I am sure there would be an immediate effect on the little shops. I am sure that if they could trade on the general holiday, it would not only mean that there would be more trade for them, but that there would be more of them trading. It might mean at last a large class of little shopkeepers, and that is exactly the sort of thing that makes all the political difference, as it does in the case of a large class of little farmers. It is not in the mere mechanical sense a matter of numbers. It is a matter of the presence and pressure of a particular social type. It is not a question merely of how many noses are counted, but in the more real sense whether the noses count. If there were anything that could be called a class of peasants, or a class of small shopkeepers, they would make their presence felt in legislation, even if it were what is called class legislation. And the very existence of that third class would be the end of what is called the class war, insofar as its theory divides all men into employers and employed. I do not mean, of course, that this little legal alteration is the only one I have to propose. I mention it first because it is the most obvious, but I mention it also because it illustrates very clearly what I mean by the two stages, the nature of the negative and positive reform. If little shops began to gain custom, and big shops began to lose it, it would mean two things, both indeed preliminary, but both practical. It would mean that the mere centripetal rush was slowed down, if not stopped, and it would mean that there were a number of new citizens in the state to whom all the ordinary socialist or servile arguments were inapplicable. Now, when you have got your considerable sprinkling of small proprietors, of men with the psychology and philosophy of small property, then you can begin to talk to them about something more like a just general settlement upon their own lines, something more like a land fit for Christians to live in. You can make them understand, as you cannot make plutocrats or proletarians understand, why the machine must not exist save as the servant of the man, why the things we produce ourselves are precious, like our own children, and why we can pay too dearly for the possession of luxury by the loss of liberty. If bodies of men only begin to be detached from the servile settlements, they will begin to form the body of our public opinion. Now, there are a large number of other advantages that could be given to the small men, which can be considered in their place. In all of them I presuppose a deliberate policy favouring the small man. But in the primary example here given, we can hardly even say that there is any question of favour. You make a law that slave owners shall free their slaves for a day. The man who has no slaves is outside the thing entirely. He does not come under it in law, because he does not come into it in logic. He has been deliberately dragged into it, not in order that all slaves shall be free for a day, but in order that all freemen shall be slaves for a lifetime. But while some of the expedients are only common justice to small property, and others a deliberate protection of small property, the point at the moment is that it will be worthwhile at the beginning to create small property, though it were only on a small scale. English citizens and yeomen would once more exist, and wherever they exist they count. There are many other ways, which can be briefly described, by which the break-up of property can be encouraged on the legal and legislative side. I shall deal with some of them later, and especially with the real responsibility which government might reasonably assume in a financial and economic condition which is becoming quite ludicrous. From the standpoint of any sane person, in any other society, the present problem of capitalist concentration is not only a question of law, but of criminal law, not to mention criminal lunacy. Of that monstrous megalomania of the big shops, with their blatant advertisements and stupid standardizations, something is said elsewhere. But it may be well to add, in the matter of the small shops, that when once they exist, they generally have an organization of their own, which is much more self-respecting and much less vulgar. This voluntary organization, as everyone knows, is called a guild, and it is perfectly capable of doing everything that really needs to be done in the way of holidays and popular festivals. 20 barbers would be quite capable of arranging with each other not to compete with each other on a particular festival, or in a particular fashion. It is amusing to note that the same people who say that a guild is a dead medieval thing that would never work are generally grumbling against the power of a guild as a living modern thing where it is actually working. In the case of the Guild of the Doctors, for instance, it is made a matter of reproach in the newspapers that the confederation in question refuses to make medical discoveries accessible to the general public. When we consider the wild and unbalanced nonsense that is made accessible to the general public by the public press, perhaps we have some reason to doubt whether our souls and bodies are not at least as safe in the hands of a guild as they are likely to be in the hands of a trust. For the moment, the main point is that small shops can be governed, even if they are not bossed by the government. Horrible as this may seem to the democratic idealists of the day, they can be governed by themselves.